And I think other people will sort of join little by little. Malcolm Boto wrote back, and he regrets he won't be able to join us today, but maybe for another session. He just had a conflict today, but really enjoyed our discussion last time. So he wanted me to communicate, just saying hi. Hey, Mika.
Hello.
Hello.
Glad I could make it.
Yeah, me too. Fantastic. Okay. Bueno, welcome to the Our Distance Unlearning Hour. Just as a reminder, this is one of our open sessions, and next week we will have another Pachaisana workshop on storytelling for social change. So we're really looking forward to that. The workshops generally run about an hour and a half, so they start at 1, but they often run until maybe 2:30 or something like that. But I know that many of you may have scheduling conflicts, so please feel free, to jump in, and if you have to leave a little bit sooner, you can do that. But just, you're welcome to participate to the extent that you can, whenever you can. We look forward to that. And just with that brief hello, I will pass it over to Richard, who has some ideas for today's meeting.
Thanks, Michelle. So, again, this is an open forum, so, I think we can all decide which kind of direction we want to take the session. Something that's been occupying my time the last week or so is the question of, and this is related to Cacho Willacuna, and I think in our work in general, I just recorded my second radio show of Dear Fellow Settler Colonizer, which actually sadly is streaming at a different time on Friday and actually clashes with the workshop, which is a pain. But it's at 2 o'clock next Friday, but I'll be able to share the recording with the group. And the main focus of that show was on the question of non-Indigenous allyship, translating and transforming into actually non-Indigenous accomplices. So how non-Indigenous people that are like many of us are focused on, amplifying the voices of Indigenous artists and communities and peoples, but also how to make ourselves available and willing to work on behalf and for those struggles and projects and these kinds of things. And as with the last show, I had a conversation with Chinupa Hanskaluga, and also talked about the work New Red Order. And actually, Michelle, you might remember way back when we were doing our This Decoloniality reading group, I think we shared a video from New Red Order. They are a public secret society, and their idea is to create a kind of space where settlers can examine their moves to innocence, but also their desire for indigeneity. So there's a kind of interesting project there, and New Red Order. So but they kind of involve non-Indigenous people as accomplices, or actually what they call them are informants, who kind of work on their behalf of their work. And one of those informants is my namesake, Jim Fletcher, who is a reformed Indian impersonator. So he was an actor that had been on Broadway, but also I think in films where he played Indian. And so he is then kind of reactivated as an accomplice of the New Red Order in their work. And so I've been thinking a lot about that and that role. And that's what the show is about, really. And again, Chinupa and I have a conversation, and we think a lot about Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, and questions of this shift from allyship to accomplice. And with that in mind, one thing I wanted to talk a little bit about today with you all was the question of, one of the elements of Cacho Willacuna is actually creating curriculum around Indigenous art making, and one of my roles in this group is to think very broadly about global Indigenous art making, and not specific to the Andean and Amazonian region. And actually, in a kind of second phase of Cacho Willacuna, an expanded global vision is something that we're really looking at. And so one question I've been kind of grappling with is, how can I, as a non-Indigenous person, in good faith, create, teach, engage with Indigenous art making and cultures in the form of curriculum? And so the first step I've done in this, and this is something where, you know, we might have other strategies that we might want to talk about, is I want to ground this curriculum based on 2 exhibitions that took place in Canada at the National Museum of Canada in Ottawa. One of them called Sakahan in 2013, and one of them called Abadakwane, which was in 2019. And they're all about international Indigenous art. So they have artists from all around the world, Indigenous artists around the world. And so I contacted the Indigenous educator and programs coordinator, Jamie Morse, to have an initial conversation about what it means to, for non-Indigenous people to create curriculum based on Indigenous art making, and kind of what, you know, and one of the things that she really talked about was creating a kind of advisory council. And I was thinking a lot about that. And I was thinking about the Indigenous artists that have been part of our network, part of our invited artists, and also American Indian Studies at OSU, lots of other frameworks for thinking about how curriculum can be developed in a collaborative way. And even if I am coordinating the course, this would be a kind of a course that would involve organization, as well as lessons, as well as bibliography that come from Indigenous context. So that's what's been on my mind. And I'd really like to, you know, the amazing thing about this group is we have such a range of people, and there are people that some people I haven't met before, but also we have students, we have faculty, we have people sometimes from beyond the university as well. And so I think it's just, you know, so this is the question that I kind of have for us today about how to think about allyship and being an accomplice of Indigenous peoples and struggles, and at the same time also thinking about curriculum and curriculum development. Because I think there's a problem of not thinking about developing curriculum and like just saying that it can't be done. I think that we have a responsibility to kind of work our curriculum that engages with Indigenous art making, at the same time knowing the limitations of our positionality when thinking about that. So that's what's been on my mind. We might have other people that have things that they've been thinking about as part of the Unlearning Hour.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
maybe
Mitchell.
in that vein, you know, like thinking about the curriculum, not just in terms of content, but in terms of form, right? Like that it may require engaging with requires a change in the way that we go about our education. But just thinking about the diversity of people that you're talking about that make up our group, and the projects that I know of that are very linked to this sort of moment of like, how do we engage with as opposed to talking about, you know, and bring in more Indigenous voices as allies and what our role is. I think that many people here have those projects. So because of that, maybe we can go in a round of introductions because we have a lot of new participants today. And I can start maybe with Mika and just for an introduction, but also to talk about like how your project, you know, working with Quechua language might run into similar challenges and opportunities that Richard is talking about, and how our individual projects might shed light or bring up issues that for consideration for this discussion that Richard is presenting us with. So let's start with you, Mika, and then we'll go. I know, yeah, I guess Lola is new, and we're so excited. And Elvia is one of our co-PIs, and we're super excited to have Elvia here as our Quechua instructor. But let's go ahead and do a round of introductions so you guys can speak for yourselves.
Yeah, my name is Mika. I'm in my 3rd year studying Latin American literature and culture. I have an affinity for learning languages, so I'm studying Spanish, Portuguese, and I'm working with Elvia studying Quechua as well. I'm in here because not only do I want to learn, but I want to unlearn lots of my colonial education. And I think to kind of give a jab at responding to your question, Richard, about how we create this curricula for global Indigenous art making and unlearning, I think the very first step is primarily addressing our ignorance when it comes to the whole question of things. Like, where in our education have we been educated on Indigenous art making before? And I know from my personal experience, not only does it go from Indigenous art making, it goes to like African art making. It spans all these like minority groups. So I think that's the very first step, just realizing where we are and where we want to go. I'm sorry. I'm excited to hear what you guys have to say too.
Thanks, Mika.
Thank you, Mika. And Lola, I'm really excited to have you here in the group. And your kind of the project that we had talked about in the past, kind of puts you in this position of being like a non-Indigenous or not from the culture that you want to work with, right? And yet the enthusiasm of participating and facilitating, but it really puts you right at the crux of that ally, accomplice situation that Richard presents us with. So tell us a little bit about yourself and about some of your project.
Yeah, I find myself at the crossroads of things a lot. So I'm here. This is my first time being here. I saw a description of this workshop series a little bit ago, and I had missed like the first two or something, but I just thought that it sounded really interesting, and I love learning about things that I don't know. So Mika and I actually worked together, and hi Mika. I brought up this workshop to him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, it's okay if you missed the first two. You should totally come on the 12th." I was like, "Okay, I guess I'll come on the 12th." So that's why I'm here now. I'm just really interested in hearing how this whole workshop series is gonna go. I would love to learn from you guys. And yeah, I also know Professor Wibbelsman a little bit because we spoke like 2 months ago or something about like a passion project idea I had around Latinx culture and identity, and kind of how me as an outsider of that cultural group, how I could do this project as an outsider kind of looking in, and I just needed her help in structuring this whole idea. So yeah, I'm a very curious person and I just like to learn things. So I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you. Thank you, Lola. And Elvia, I'm so excited to have you here. Bienvenida. Elvia, it's so important for you to be here in this particular discussion because of the question that Richard is raising. And we have some, we have some Native American faculty and students, broader representation across our campus. But in terms of Latin American Indigenous perspectives and people as members of our faculty, in terms of that diversity, estás solita un poquito como la única, ¿no? Entonces, we're so excited to hear your perspective on all of this, not just as an educator, but also as someone from Bolivia, that represents these cultures. Entonces, te invito a que te presentes, and you can do it in Spanish, in English, in Quechua, lo que tú quieras.
Iwainaya. So first, I would like to say that I'm sorry I didn't participate the last time because I was in another workshop with U Chicago talking about redesign. So we talk about that topic that Richard is brought today, is how we teach Indigenous languages, forgetting, right, the settings that we already have from other languages, right? Something that other language like Quechua and Aymara, Guarani are following are the rules and the structure of English or Spanish or something, but doing that, we are forgetting our sense of the language, right? Sometimes we are too much focused on how we are going to compare, how we are going to achieve the same knowledge that other language has, and forgetting that the culture is inside, the conversation is inside, those elements that make the difference between a large language and another underrepresented language like Quechua. So, and I think that your question, Richard, is very important. And I think that I faced that conversation, that question years ago when I was in Bolivia working in the Minister of Education, when they say, we want to change the curriculum to a curriculum regionalizado. That was the word. So it was like, we want in some regions that speak Quechua, we want to have our language, our knowledge, our indigenous practices, and all our things that we do inserted in the formal curriculum in the schools. It was a very huge work in Bolivia, and it was rejected in many, many places. Like, so we are going to talk about chemic or physics, or we are going to talk about the chakra. What's the importance? In the city, people don't have the chakra. It's not important to talk about chakra. It's important to talk about physics or something. So I think that that is the first step, right? As Mika mentioned, is to relearn, right? Rethink about what we want, right? And how we are going to not insert. I think that we are not inserting knowledge, we are recognizing the other knowledge that people have. When we talk about insert, is something like, okay, we are going to put some part of salt in this, mixing of ingredients. No, it's something like we are going to prepare a different dish and we are going to incorporate that in our menu. That is something that we are going to respect the ingredients, we are going to respect all of that, and we are going to be part of Quechua with the sense, with the culture, with all the knowledge that we have. And it's going to happen the same thing with Aymaras and Guaranis and all of that. I think that this group is, the seed for talking about that, for giving that recognition, right? The last semester we invite people, right? People that do not have that formal education, but they are very good represented from their culture, right? The knowledge that they have, of course, are not certification for other institutions, but the certification that they have is the life, is the culture, is the community, is the grandparents, is the doing, right? Something that's very difficult. And I think that you remember, Michelle, the last year when the idea of having the llama, right, bringing to the oval only for students to see a little bit, to talk with the persons who are raising these animals. We can talk a little bit how this llama, right, is living in Ohio when it is, from the Andes and all of that. But what we face insurance for the animals, a lot of things that stops that idea. We never had the llama here. So now it's moment maybe to think about is real something that we are going to put in the in the writing? Is it going to happen really? How? Because it's not only to rethink about our classrooms, it's also rethink the structure of the rules in an institution. Are they going to accept someone that does not have the profile or education, right, that corresponds to speaking with a grad student, with the students from the university, right? So it's very difficult to think, right, how we are going to talk about curricula, right, taking into account the rules of the institution and everything, right? So thank you so much. I think that this topic is very, very interesting.
I think this launches a lot of things. So I know there are a few people that still need to introduce themselves, and maybe by way of your comments, you can introduce yourselves. But just to reiterate what Elvia just said, this idea is not to insert content in existing structures, right? But to challenge the structure itself. And Richard, I attended a conference many years ago where they were talking about like getting rid of the classroom, like that the classroom itself is sort of like an imposition. And maybe along the lines of the barriers that Elvia indicates, like when we try to bring that llama to campus. But among the barriers in curriculum, often we're challenged of saying, yeah, okay, fine, but how are you going to assess that? Like the assessment then becomes like a hurdle. What grade are you going to assign? And with Mika, we had that experience, in our class last spring before COVID shut down, but we kind of challenged ourselves, and including me, right, of trying to do something really, really different and then put it on the professor to figure out, like, how the heck do you assess this as an exam, right? But I thought it was a really productive exercise. And Mika, if you want to talk about that later, I invite that. So let's open it up for conversation. And then as you bring in your comments, introduce yourselves because we didn't hear from Eric, Kurt, and Jonathan. So we definitely want to know who you are for those who don't know you yet.
Hey everybody, I'm Kurt. I am one of the people Richard mentioned that is kind of a part in the larger community. I live in West Virginia. I grew up on the border in Texas and in South America and in Wisconsin. And I don't know, I kind of got to the point at a certain time a few years ago where I had finally had enough of my own brain, and from there it kind of led me to why my brain is the way it is, and how I don't like to use the word programming, but how I've been programmed through the years, and from there how everybody's been programmed through the years, and the systems which did it, and how and why and all that. And one thing led to another, and I found out about this group through my brother Eric, who's also on this call. And hi, I'm really happy to be here, and I really spend most of my time listening, and I've got a lot of listening to do. So thank you all.
I think we can continue introducing, but we should also kind of keep if we keep the discussion. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Elbia was saying, which was, I mean, one of the specific challenges. I mean, you mentioning Guarani and other languages, and just thinking about how to create dialogues across language and cultures within indigenous contexts, and that was one of the big questions one of the big questions that I had for a global indigenous art project, which was how to maintain, starting out with the very clear position of my not being part of that world, but knowing that it is a world, and not, so then any one representative of certain communities or languages or geographical areas or even art forms and art structures within that world don't speak for other regions and these kinds of things. So it's a really challenging setup to even think about what a global indigenous art context would be. And if we have time later today, and if we don't, it's fine, I'll send you the link. I was sent a video by an indigenous curator and artist who I've been working with called Leoli Ashragi, who is Samoan, and they identify as they were saying, they sent me a video of a kind of roundtable of indigenous artists from 2016, and I was just thinking about that moment. I know many of these artists from their work, and I know that there are Maori artists, there were Native American artists, there were I know there's at least one artist who was part of New Red Order who is Ojibwe, and the fact that the continuities of their conversation and the connection points of their conversations were really informing. Like, not that there was this, separation wasn't there. Actually, it was about making those continuities. However, when non-Indigenous people make those connections, I think there's a difference and a different valence there when those connections are being made. So I think the specificity of the context are really important, and languages, but how to bridge and how to respectfully show the complexity and way in which dialogue can go across cultures, communities, and contexts.
just introduce myself really quickly and say I'm Eric Johnson. I'm the curator for Thompson Special Collections at OSU Libraries. And a lot of what's been said today, in particular, stuff that Richard just said, but also what he said, riffing on what Elvia said, really resonates with me right now. The ideas of recognizing, remixing. Michelle, you were talking about specifically excuse me, not insertion, but challenging. These are all things that I have to deal with quite a bit in my role at the library, where I'm responsible for building collections and building collections that are going to meet the needs of scholars, students, and teachers right now, but also thinking forward to next year, to 10 years from now, to 10 curators from now when I'm long dead and in the ground. And creating kind of a legacy and a collection that is going to continue to be vibrant and not to just be used in and of itself, but inspire new ways of collecting and new ways of using materials. And one of the issues that we really face, and I'm in this committee with the university libraries that's exploring how to define collections through a social justice lens and what that means for our existing collections, and specifically what that means for how we go about collecting things. One of the areas where I'm really invested in with this process is thinking about Latin America and the means by which we acquire Latin American and specifically indigenous related collections, because the whole channel or the channels, the predominant channels by which libraries acquire their materials is automatically stacked against our ability to collect effectively in these areas, especially when we're talking about indigenous creators, because they do not have the distribution and production patterns that libraries, and face it, we're basically a corporate entity at Ohio State, and the library is a purchasing agent within that corporate entity. And the university's push towards all sorts of economic efficiencies right now means that everything we do is essentially, despite what the university says about wanting to support the little guy and diversify what we do, it is creating efficiencies that are marginalizing marginalized communities even further. So thinking about how we get past this to create collections that are really responding to what's been created today, as well as what we need to use as scholars and students, is a real challenge. But then taking a next step from that, thinking about once those are here, how does all of that intersect with and integrate with the traditional Western canon-based collections and the ideas of authority that we talk about there? So like Shakespeare and the book as formal object in the Western world, that dominates traditionally what we've done in terms of humanities research in the Western world. But where does, cheap ass pamphlet printed on incredibly bad wood pulp paper that came straight out of the Yucatan, how does that fit in terms of authority? And it's not about, like you said, it's not about insertion. It's about taking that kind of format, that kind of product, and having it challenge our understanding of what authority actually is when it comes to the materials we use. So these are a bunch of big ideas. I don't have answers for any of this stuff, but this is what I'm currently consumed by. And we had a really, really big meeting about this. We're meeting regularly in the library, my group, to discuss this, and had a really vibrant conversation about it yesterday, and are trying to lay out kind of the parameters and the framework for how we change what we do at the university in the library, which ultimately underpins what we're able to do in the classroom and the research room. So all of this stuff really resonates with me, and I've been bringing a lot of the Cachuila Kuna group stuff and the Unlearning Hour things into my conversations in that area, and it's been really nice. So anyhow, I'll shut up now.
So how interesting, Eric. I see a lot of parallels with what Elvia was saying about lesser taught languages, right? So, on the one hand, we're saying, guys, we need to bring lesser taught languages into the wheelhouse of, for example, what SPPO does, in terms of languages, but it doesn't fit neatly, right? And so therefore it continues to be marginalized by the wheelhouse of the department. So the issue is, how do we change the wheelhouse in order to clearly and actually incorporate, what we consider to be lesser taught languages, so that they stop being lesser taught and just taught, like. But it makes me think, Eric, about how the way that things are laid out institutionally and structurally carves pathways that enable or disable dialogue, right? So going back to what Richard was saying about, like, what kind of dialogues can we have if they're south to south intersectionalities or north to south intersectionalities. Like, I think that the structures that we impose either facilitate or don't facilitate the types of dialogues that we have, you know?
And something ultimately has to give, because all of this talk about efficiencies and about more egalitarian approaches to doing things and being more open in our kind of pursuit of EDI and social justice, a lot of times what the university says it wants to do does not at all mesh with the procedures that are put into place. And another layer within the library is like, let's pretend we actually get to this point where we can easily bring in stuff from undertaught linguistic communities. Okay, now we've purchased it. We figured out how to get it from Central South America into the library on the Oval. Now it's going to sit there because the library has no one who does those languages. And that's the next step, is how do we then, once we get it, how do we create good access points with cataloging, with finding aids? We've been piloting certain things with bilingual finding aid production, but all of that requires money and it requires expertise. And a library, I can tell you right now, our library is not going to hire a Quechua cataloger. So we could go to Elvia, but she has a job to do that's all her own. So there are all of these other things to then work out. Like, how committed are we as an institution really to all of this? And do we really realize what that commitment is going to entail? And I don't know that administrators, because I've been in a lot of administrative meetings about these kinds of things, I don't know that they've truly, really embraced those questions. And they're definitely not prepared to give a good answer to it yet.
I guess I can, I don't know if everybody has introduced themselves or not. I have a lot of things kicking around in my mind. It's a great conversation. A lot of things that I could add as Jonathan Burgoyne, the medievalist in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. That's who I am, although I teach all sorts of things in our department, from contemporary Spanish culture to language courses. But I just wanted to share my thoughts on some of the topics that came up, beginning with Richard, who's talking about what does it mean to be an ally or an advocate or an accomplice, discussions about the curriculum, and Kurt's comments about programming. And I'm thinking of, these systems and grids within we work that allow us to know the things that we know that go beyond universities, right? Our lives, our families create those kinds of grids too. And so just to get back to, and also this question of the Western canon and Western traditions, I just want to share a little something about myself. I grew up as kind of a feral, free-range child in San Francisco with no understanding of anything that we're discussing in this group, no awareness of language or literature, of cosmologies, of history. None, all right? I was very much the product of the Californian pre-Copernican culture, right? There was no, and I was not trained or programmed in school or from my family to do anything at all. I kind of thought I would do sciences when I went into college, and that's what I studied, chemistry, for about a year. It's in everything that I know. I want to try to sum this up. I don't want to go over this, but everything that I know about alternative ways of knowing things, everything that I know about the Western tradition, which to me was an alternative. I learned about all of those things as somebody who felt very much outside of all of that, wasn't aware of being interpolated in a Western tradition because I didn't know that there was such a grid. And I discovered all of those things through a Spanish department. Everything I know about art, history, science, philosophy, I studied ethics, I studied metaphysics, I studied liberation theology, all at the feet of my Chicano mentor, who was also teaching courses about California history, and Joaquin Murrieta. I learned everything that I know about philosophy from Borges in Spanish. I learned all of these things that now we're trying to also dismantle, some of them that we're trying to dismantle. I came at those as very much feeling like a foreigner. I learned about the Western canon in a foreign language, and I use that word deliberately because French was a foreign language to me. And Spanish is still a foreign language. And so that was a huge discovery for me. I didn't know at the time that I just knew that I was embarking on this great adventure and that I was learning all these things, but I had to also learn Latin, right? And that gave me access to all of these different sources of knowledge and beauty, really, and an insight into the human condition, which what drove me to want to be a professor. I wanted to share that experience. I wanted to have everybody have access to that like I did. So the idea of dismantling the classroom, I have a very ambivalent feeling about that, right? And dismantling the systems of a Spanish department, I think, well, that was the key to me. I was just adrift, right? So I have a lot of feelings about that. As far as being an advocate, I don't have much. I don't have any answers for Richard. I mean, I think my answer for the curriculum is that we need to make the. I'm not ready to give up on creating better access, because I know that we can understand each other, right? That dismantling the grid, getting rid of the systems, I don't know that, like, you know, again, maybe I've been reading too much Foucault lately. I don't think we can stand outside of discourse. I don't think we can ever get outside of the grid.
So maybe one thing I'll throw in there, and it's a word that we use a lot here in our workshops and in our Unlearning hour, is not that we're seeking to debunk, you know, the West completely, or Western institutions or systems or things like that, but yes, to decenter. So that word decenter forces like an acknowledgement of a diversity of ways of doing things that Elvia was talking about. So I wonder, Richard, we'll kind of pass it back to you about how does all this weigh into this idea of like creating a curriculum for this course in dialogue with Indigenous artists, you know?
Well, I mean, I want to go back to what Mika was saying earlier, which I think kind of maybe prompted some of what Jonathan just said as well, which is kind of you start from what the grid is, as it were, and there is a kind of conception of this as a kind of hidden curriculum that is there or kind of understood, and therefore it's important to kind of move from that. At the same time, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I wouldn't say that. There's a very sensitive thing here, which is to not, and this is about appropriation of Indigenous ways of knowing as a mechanism to then teach it. So the idea that we have to abandon all inherited settler structures in order to then teach Indigenous knowledge is not, as Jonathan said, also not kind of feasible or possible. We can't kind of undo ourselves in the process. I mean, we can challenge entrenched ideas. What was that, sorry?
I said, in my particular life experience, it's not only not possible, but it would not be desirable.
No, because it would be like another kind of version of like playing native, as it were, in this kind of sense. And I think that there are definitely, it's about kind of acknowledging limitations, you know, but then also how to find best ways of bringing in those dialogues and conversations. And I do think, if I could just play just a few minutes of this video, because there's something, this is a film that is made about this workshop, about this roundtable. And so there's and I think, Michelle, you're going to be kind of interested in what the mechanisms that they use to, it's a kind of tripartite division of screens, and in the middle there are virtual reproductions of objects. And I think Eric will kind of appreciate this. But all I want to kind of convey in showing you this, and I don't think we have time to watch the whole thing, is I would like to try and understand a way of bringing this kind of conversation and the fruits of this conversation and the kind of what is achieved by this kind of conversation between Indigenous artists from around the world into the classroom. And that might not mean, you know, complete methodological transformation, but it might mean just, you know, understanding how some of them maybe the fault lines that we've been, again, back to Mika's point, like kind of where are we starting from? And how do we get to this? So I guess it's kind of interesting. We've got a Zoom-like kind of discussion going here, and I'm going to show you something else. And then we'll come back to the Zoom-like discussion, and let's see what is the same and what is not the same in the kind of ways in which these artists are discussing it. So let me, we'll just play 5 minutes of it. I don't want to, again, I don't want to, we keep this to an hour. So I don't want to take up too much time, and you've got the link so you can watch it further, but let me just share my screen. And I'll share my sound. Here it is.
I've always been struck when we're writing about art objects, whether West or Indigenous, the object is always in the present tense, even if it was made in the past. Mm-hmm. And as a maker, I always felt that I would be making some objects that somebody would be treating in the present tense always. Mm. But I've also got teachings, a number of elders, Roy Bison's one of them, and he was talking about how particular drum will get used up and don't break down and so on, but it'll be replaced by another drum. And so there's the knowledge in the drum of how to make the next drum by looking at old drums, but also it's equally present in the body of the person who's the maker, who passes it on to another person, so it's always passed on. I don't know if the model allows for innovation, but I don't see how it wouldn't, you know, that because there's always, you're not going to have the fifth generation back, so you're always looking back, and there's going to be things that you're bringing forward, errors that you're going to replicate, changes you're going to make.
Like the ship Argo replaced piece by piece by piece.
Yeah.
Such that we don't have a sense of its fabrication in full, because it always is what it is, despite the fact that it's always been changing.
I think an important thing in this, like talking about this, is like there's death in this life cycle. And I feel like the things we've talked about are like how our objects that we're collected and are archived and we're making now, we don't seem to consider their death in its life cycle. We don't say this time it's time to put this away, it's time for it to go back where it came from, or we're making things with materials that don't have a life cycle. And I think that if we're talking about schism, that's a big schism to say I'm making something out of plastics or carbon fiber, or versus I'm making something with plant material that I can actually put back in the ground, or leather that's been treated with chemicals.
That's also the same for like objects that were collected that are in anthropological collections that would have been destroyed because that was a way of keeping the knowledge within the tribe. It's like that gets destroyed and so no other tribe can take that, but that has changed now.
But that's it. I mean, that's the main Indigenous critique of the museum, is that the museum wants to own the objects and replace the objects for the people. And so we don't see that knowledge that's passed to the people equally with the drum or whatever object. And so it's this cult of preservation, of conservation, and it's fear, I believe, of the living, a fear of the present, always projecting to the future tense where someone might be able to take care of it better, you know, when you think of restoration and so on. Whereas if you acknowledge that the knowledge is also in the body of the person, then you want those bodies around. Right?
Those bodies should hopefully be educated enough to be able to have those traditions, because if right now we're at a place where we don't always have all of our traditions, so it's like hopefully in the future, maybe when we're making objects for the future, we won't have the schism, and we will be able to bury our old objects and say, like, they've lived their life, and we learned all we possibly could from them. And the other thing about that is that they are anthropomorphized, but beyond that, if we say these objects have spirits in them, you know, you say, well, now it's time for the spirit to finally, you know, go back home, and because I mean, hopefully we've stopped putting ancestors' bones in museums, and they, you know, but eventually that should happen to the objects.
That fits with the knowledge of our critique of elders that came up earlier. At some point, some knowledge has to die because it was inappropriate to the new present.
The term in Samoan for treasured object is the same as the term for a treasured person. Mea sina. And sina, mea being something, and sina being a contraction of the old language for whiteness, and whiteness being the space in the center of a round meeting place where we conjure and remember the elders and ancestors and gods and spirits, trying to kind of tread lightly next to all the old people, which are their knowledge and their presences are in these objects, these measina, and the kind of the retiring of them is something that I keep thinking about when we finally one day have control to fulfill our responsibilities to them. Most of the sparkcloth needs to go back into the soil because it's meant to be worn, it's meant to be part of ceremony, and then it goes back. And we make the next one as, you know, as that one is crumbling, you make a new one.
It's quite a violent act to separate the people from the things, and of course, you know, it came out of this anxiety that, you know, the idea that the people were dying, and so we'll hold on to these things as tightly as we can. And it's kind of like I think it's another kind of sickness, like it's also now embedded with power and knowledge. So it's deeply threatening to think that you could, you know, let those things go to rest. But it's also deeply problematic to think that they're always going to be in this kind of perpetual stasis as well.
That feeling of encountering something as well, you know, that feeling of stasis in a museum that had a friend recently say to me, you know, these things are on life support. Right? Sort of, you know, held there in this sort of, I don't know, cryogenic chamber, chamber of some kind, right? Strange but limbo. For who and for when? Like what time?
Again, we could watch more, but I just wanted to give a taste. And just so you know, Leole Ashragi is the artist, the Samoan artist who was in the jumper. They were the person that sent me the link, and so I guess I'm transmitting that into this group, that link and that conversation.
I really liked the comments about the cult of conservation. I mean, obviously, this is a big thing that I live in with rare books and manuscripts, and it's an interesting world to live in from the standpoint that whether it's a purchase that we make or a donation that's made, that material is considered by the university an asset, a fiscal asset. So one of the things I have to do every July is come up with an insurance schedule for the entire rare books and manuscripts library. And at last count, you know, we've got line item things for things that are valued above a certain amount, and then we have the general collections. But the non-line item stuff is valued at in excess of $250 million for that collection, and that's the non-special stuff. And so the university treats it in this way, and I understand this, and it's like we've got to preserve it for that reason, and we preserve it for the ongoing use and utility of scholars and students, et cetera. But over the years, I've pushed back on this a little bit, like not saying we need to destroy this stuff, but we need to have a component of our collection that is perishable. And so I have a collection, and the compromise that we came to is that we do not catalog it. Now, this isn't very special stuff. We're not talking about like a first folio of Shakespeare or rare, you know, indigenous manuscripts from, you know, the pre-Columbian period. But we have stuff that is not cataloged, that typically has been rock bottom prices or donations that we pass around and don't ever think about conserving. Let it be used how it's going to be used, and let it fall apart. And if it gets to a point where ultimately we have to throw it away, then fine, that's what we do, because ultimately books and manuscripts are produced to be utilitarian objects that get worn away. Another thing that I haven't quite put into effect, I get a lot of pushback from this from colleagues at the library, but also colleagues beyond OSU. One of the current hot topics, as those of you who work with books know, or historic books know, is everyone likes dirty books now. So things full of the notes of scholars and owners, over the course of centuries. And I love these things too, but one of the things that's always bugged me is that, okay, I acquire something that has, say, 500 years worth of successive owner's notes in it. And now it comes to Ohio State and no one can ever write in it again. So it's like, why shouldn't Jonathan come in and be able to look at, say, one of our early Spanish printings that floats his boat and scribble commentary in it? Now, I'm not advocating that we do this with all of our books, but I'm trying to get a component of the collection up that is writable, that scholars can come in and we don't care. Write your stuff in it, because 300 years from now, having Jonathan's notes and Michelle's notes and Richard's notes and students' notes and everything else in the margins is going to be really cool for someone. So it's like getting past this cult of conservation and really thinking about how do we make these things that are the mechanisms by which we know the past that still exist in the present. I love that opening comment that he made. We also have to recognize that these things in some regard are going to need to speak to the future. And so it's this really challenging thing that's a component of my job that I'm always thinking about and constantly getting pushed back on by curators around the world, because the industry has not moved past the cult of conservation yet.
Well, it makes me think, and I'll invite Mika to jump in here, but as we work with our curator group for the Andean and Amazonian arts collection, right? It's a very small collection. We don't respond to anybody except ourselves, basically. None of our stuff is insured, we're just so small, right? But in a way, it gives us the freedom to experiment with methods and to really reflect on some of the traps that we fall into. So for example, to legitimate ourselves as like an actual collection, have like nice display cabinets, so that people recognize it and value it. But at the same time, trying to push against, some of those traditional museum structures. So perhaps we can have like a longer discussion, because we are able to experiment with pretty radical ideas. And we take our cues, Eric, from you, like the idea of not being a white gloves institution. Anytime we have a workshop, anything, we open our cases and people are surprised that they can handle the objects for the most part, right? But it's a real challenge, Mika. I don't know, like this idea of, including a component of the collection that is perishable, let it be used, let it fall apart, it really speaks to our attention, for example, to object ontologies, and thinking about ways in which, we don't want to just keep them there perpetually forever. If we are talking about the sentient aspects of some of these objects, not all of them, but some of them, then what do we do? Like, how do we address that? Not just say something and do something different, right? But how do we actually implement that in our practices?
And I definitely think that goes back to what you were saying about our institutions and our structures, and for our collection in particular, what decision are we going to make? Are we going to enable dialogue, or are we going to disable dialogue by shoving everything behind the case? And I think that really comes back to this question of kind of challenging these preconceived notions we have and rethinking these structures that are in place, and what role we have as individuals to kind of challenge these structures. And I would like to share what Michelle and I did in the class we had last semester when we had a midterm, something conventionally. You sit down, she gave us a test. It had like 8 questions, 6 questions, and there were short answer, and we had to write about them. And instead, I kind of got the class together. We made a circle in the room and we had a wonderful discussion, one of the best discussions we'd had as a class the entire semester, and everyone was sharing their ideas. And I think it was much more richer from my experience, the sharing of knowledge is back and forth rather than doing the standard thing of putting your answers on a piece of paper, turning it in, and waiting for your test results. It was much more active, and it's definitely something that you can do one way or the other. It's just challenging and looking at what are you doing now and what would you gain by doing something differently.
And that alternative method, like for the test, started with prompts about breaking the rules, breaking the typical exam rules, and And I remember when Brandon started talking to someone sitting next to him that they were all like, oh my God, they're talking during an exam, you know? But it took a little bit of encouragement for people to break the rules. And once they did, like Mika said, it was an amazing outcome. And also a challenge to assess, right? Like, how do you assess? It was incredible. It was something that really impacted all of us, including me. And then the issue of the grading, you know, like within the structure pulls us back in, you know. But there was a discussion about like grades, for example, as an inhibitor to learning, you know, and like the barriers that we put up ourselves. So yeah, I love what you're saying, Mika, about the institutions, you know, and how institutional practices, we have to be reflexive of them in terms of what they enable, you know, and the skills that they develop, and depending on the context, you know, how they inhibit us from moving forward. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to move back to the, with some of these issues in mind, that question of the inhibitors, back to the question of the curriculum as a whole, and thinking of what we were just watching with the video, and this, not just from the question of objects, but the question of, you know, what, you know, individuals and humans that, you know, are, you know, a curriculum is a way of actually also creating something to last longer than maybe it should do as well. I mean, we all kind of update our curricula, you know, our syllabi, and we kind of try and add new readings and get things going like this. But I've been thinking about how curriculum development can be generative from kind of provisional spaces, as it were. And so one way to do this, I think, not only is, I've been thinking about temporary exhibitions as a site for creating curriculum, which I think is an interesting question, because it's not like you're creating a curriculum for permanent installations and things like that. There's a kind of temporary nature to it. But also, what would it mean to create a curriculum which you basically argue that this curriculum comes from dialogues, exchanges, and discussions with individual knowledge keepers, artists, publishers, these kinds of things. And that is what's happening with this project that we've mentioned a few times in this group, but I'll put another link in the chat to this. This is the next, the reading room at the Columbus Printed Arts in downtown, just south of downtown Columbus. And this is the project where Leolia Shiragi is the guest librarian. That's their official title. And here's the link. And one of our artists from Cachawilacuna, Sebastian Calfuqueo Aliste, is one of the artists who is part of this. And part of this project is for Indigenous artists, and it bound up with language as well. The translation from the Samoan is, language teachers be courageous. And basically each Indigenous artist or knowledge keeper has provided us with a bibliography of books that then we're purchasing for the library. And then, and this is a library that doesn't have an institutional home. This is a non-existent, this is a floating library. And then also create posters and prints based on language phrases from their Indigenous languages. And I'm thinking about communicating, and we're on the border of this, and thinking about this, what would it mean to invite these artists to be part of curriculum development? And that means that those books that they chose be grounded in this. And we can also point back in terms of curriculum to individuals who recommended those books, and not a kind of, this is the most obvious text to read on this topic. So there's a kind of paper trail, as it were, or even a kind of a human trail of knowledge transmission that's based in that project. So beyond objects, that was an element there too, that how curriculum can be developed in that way.
Adding to that, I would like to step on here a little bit. For example, where I see in the concept, even with the concept of a museum, right? If you go to Ecuador or Bolivia, I'm going to talk always about Bolivia, that's my experience. In my country, for example, we have the museos comunitarios, right? In the museos comunitarios, we have the elements, right, that they have Sometimes they are just duplicate elements. Sometimes the original one is, very well protected in some place or something. But why we do that? Why we are afraid to give the elements that from the community to the museum? Because it's a very clear example is, for example, the field, where the kids play like football, something in the community. Once the government came and built a real, field from playing football, they closed the space. They put, walls and everything. Now the kids cannot play anymore. It's closed for everyone. So what the museum, right, was the concept for a museum in the community is that you can smell it, you can see it, you can see the uses that they have. In the museum, in the community museum, it's not important the element. If they have, a plate, for example, a plate is part of the context that they give. They put chuños there, they put corn there, they put elements that say, okay, so this plate was used for these elements, right? And sometimes that's why many communities, right, they have the duplicate elements that they found, but they don't want to give that to the person who came to investigate the elements. Anthropologists, they hide that because they say no, because we are not going to be able to see it again. We are not going to be able to. The same thing that happens with the football, field that we had before. It was a land, with ground and stones and everything, but we were able to play there. Now we are not. It's closed. It's going to happen the same thing with our elements that we found in our land. So we are not going to give that to people because that's going to be, to close for our community.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I've got to run. I've just realized I have a student's exam at 2. But I just wanted to wait for you to finish. That was really, important to hear. And I'll let you, Michelle will finish off the discussion and I'll let you go. But I'll see you all next week. It was really enjoyable to see you all and see new faces and old faces. Take care.
Yeah, Richard. Thanks. Yeah, Elvie, I think everything you say is incredibly compelling, and the idea of museums shutting things down effectively. And this is where I've had some very, very fiery conversations in my time at the library with colleagues about what our mission actually is. And I very much liked my boss when I came here, but philosophically, we butted heads quite a bit. He was very much someone who was much more traditional about the materials in the library needed to be first and foremost for the use of the random researcher from a foreign land who may come and use our stuff. And then it just needed to be preserved in the building. And my thing was constantly, we are a land grant institution. There's been a public trust placed in us to serve the public. And that means anything that is in our library that taxpayer money is being expended on, and that even if something is donated to us, taxpayer money is going to the upkeep, the storage, the climate control, my salary, however you want to structure that. So therefore, the public needs to have access to this. And so there are many folks in the heritage industry, I hate that word, but we'll use it, or that phrase, but we'll use it because it's convenient, who are coming around to this idea that museums and libraries shouldn't be full of cases. They should be full of rooms that welcome people in to actually handle stuff. This is one reason I could really never actually work in a museum. And I've gotten job offers from some really nice places. And it's like, I don't believe in the museum in the same way that I believe in the library. Their philosophies are very, very different. But this is something that I think we constantly need to be pushing back on, as this idea of creating walls and creating barriers. And it's one thing I loved about one of Sebastian's installations, so to speak, was crawling into the exhibition case with the artifacts. How cool is that? And that really resonated with me, because that's something I never want to have to see someone like Sebastian do. I want to see that exhibition case basically be the classroom or the reading room or the lobby of Scott Lab on OSU's campus when we took all of our early Galileo stuff for the physicist students to look at. Open it up, bring people in. And that is something we have to fight for all the time.
I love the idea of the community room. We've talked about that, as like the the model for, and a space, a communal space that is multi-use, you know, where people have access to things, but that other things happen there, like whether they're meals or discussions or festivals or things like that, that ultimately bring in. So, for example, if we think about artifacts, you know, or books, they bring them into that celebration of culture and diversity and things like that, into those discussions, you know, in a very active way. One other thing, Elvia, is about process, right? Like, so Eric, we've had this conversation that often our collections have to do with finished products, you know, and that we don't see all of the raw materials and that type of thing, you know, that kind of go into the making of something. But throwing back the question, and I'm going to try to respect Richard's idea of like the 1 hour. So we'll wrap up here in a few minutes, but throwing in the question of what do we do then, you know, because like Jonathan says, you know, as an institution, we do have sort of this mandate to educate and inform people and make people aware of different cultures or different issues around the world, right? So we do play that role as educators. And at the same time, Elvia brings us this concern, you know, of like, well, the violence of separating, you know, products from the people who made them and the uses that they serve, right? So like saying you can no longer play on this soccer field, you know, now we have this. And as Mika pointed out in the chat, you know, coming back down to possession. So how do we negotiate that? Because we are within the institution. And I think that Richard's first podcast, the first radio interview, talking about the difference between preservation and maintenance, right? And what role settler colonialists might play, right? Can maybe inform some of this, that we are in the institution, we work within the institution, you know, like this, it is what it is. And yet we have to create spaces for more inclusion and more diversity and more participation, maybe going back to what Elvia said, not just of the content, you know, but also with a willingness to sort of tweak, change to the extent that we can the structure, right? So I don't know what you guys think about that, if anybody wants to have some final thoughts before we wrap up.
I like Mika's comment. I think it's a very thought-provoking comment. The latest thing you put in, all comes back to possession. And I think this is not just about the artifacts that we're talking about or the idea of museums and building walls, but it's also about the possession of the idea of who can talk about what and who can work in what area. And the possession, the sense of possession about cultural authority and all of these things. And these are all areas that really need to be unpacked and problematized and, you know, everything else, decentered, recentered, uncentered, whatever words you want to use. And really getting down to the notion that everything should be shared possession. Just because Ohio State, where we all work or go to school, or what, you know, the center of this particular discussion we're in right now, Ohio State might own really nice historic resources and artifacts. And we do have possession in that kind of legal, fiscal, proprietary sort of sense. But we can work towards an understanding of communal possession and absolutely open possession insofar as legally we're allowed to do that, by making this stuff as available as possible. And that's putting it in front of people, doing kind of the community rooms you're talking about, Michelle, you know, figuring out ways to mediate that possession and to share the idea of possession. And this is tough, you know, it's very, very hard because our whole administrative structures, our fiscal structures, our legal structures are, to use Kurt's word from the beginning, programmed against that. We're all programmed to try to not think that way. And this is a huge area of unlearning that I think we could benefit from as a corporate entity, is getting out of that programming. But yeah, so thanks for putting that in, Mika. I thought that was, I've got a lot of things going through my head about possession right now.
And I think what you say about, yeah, the possession of authority is paramount to this discussion.
Yeah, that was a big part of Richard's comment that I think is worth talking about more in another meeting, right? About how to be an advocate, how to be an accomplice, right? And Because I sense that there's some anxiety about that, right? This question of, well, speaking, where's my subject placement in this discourse about anything really, culture, knowledge, or possession even. So that's something, and myself, my experience, shows is sort of marked with moments of those same sorts of intentions, right? But I think there are other models, getting back to maybe what Eric was saying. I think, the just as traditional as the idea of stewardship rather than possession, right? To be a custodian or to be a steward, right, suggests a different relationship with that idea of possession. You can, be the owner of a farm or a flock, but you are caring for it and tending for it for somebody else, right?
I just wanted to share one of like a deep frustration. I might have told you this before, Michelle, and I'm sure Kurt, you've heard this from me. But a couple of years ago, I was asked to give a lecture at the International Medieval Congress on building a teaching medieval manuscript collection. And so I did my thing, talked about what we've done at Ohio State to create a whole new collection, basically, but one that really helps drive undergraduate research and direct access to the materials. And there was another lecturer on this panel who came from a not land-grant institution, came from an Ivy League institution with a sensational collection of medieval manuscripts, one of the best in the country. And in the Q&A session afterwards, I've never wanted to throat punch a fellow panelist so much in my life. And this guy's a great scholar. Like, I really like him. We're pals, all of this stuff. But he said, I really think we need to see the pendulum start to swing the other way, where we reinforce to students, the ones who really don't know this material, how much of a privilege it is to let them touch these things, to let them have access. And we need to like pull back a little bit. And I'm sitting there like, this is a really, really great thing for you to say, where you've got millions of dollars a year to spend. You've got a collection that dwarfs ours. You've got students who are given, just by the fact of being enrolled in your school, they're guaranteed X thousands of dollars as an undergraduate to go off and travel and do their own projects as part of an undergraduate thesis, all of these things. And it's like, and you have the audacity to tell me we need to start pulling back on giving students meaningful exposure to these things and giving them the chance to create original scholarship. It might not be expert and tenure worthy scholarship, but they're beginners. It's like, give them a place to start rather than just regurgitate, whatever it is that I might say is their manuscript instructor. And it's like that sense of, we're behind the 8 ball to such a degree in places like Ohio State, because while we're one of the biggest schools in the country, we don't have the same clout in my world as some of these non-land grant places that have, they might be doing great things. I'm not throwing this institution entirely under the bus, but that philosophy really slows down what we can do as an industry in terms of activating the collections that are in our care and starting to share and facilitate that idea of possession and that idea of stewardship. And oh my God, you can tell I'm still steamed about this, and it's 2 years later.
I could geek out with you some more too if we want to talk about books, but I mean, I'm sure and maybe the rest of the room don't, but it's not just the access, right? He's advocating for promoting that fetishizing of the object, right? And the archives I work in are in Spain and in Paris and London. And or if you go to Salamanca, you want to see the Libro de Buen Amor, you have to go into a vault, and you feel like you have to wear some priestly gown before you go before the Almighty, right? That's that erratic effect, right? But what those people don't know, who are trying to promote that fetishizing of the object, is that they're distorting our knowledge of what those objects are, right? I mean, I have a little anecdote, right? Of an edition that I published. One of the, well, I don't want to geek out on it too much, but what I'm just trying to say is that transforms the way scholars look at the objects that they're studying, and that can become a hurdle. I'm not saying you can't get past it, but it certainly colors the way people begin to learn about the objects that are housed that way or conserved that way, right? So they're doing a real disservice to scholars who really know and care and want to study those objects by creating that kind of an air, right?
Yep.
It's not just the access; it's the attitude that he was advocating for, right? He wanted them to have a sense of reverence, right?
Yeah.
Right? And that's totally right. Why would you have a sense of reverence for a comic book?
Now we're all seeing. We're there. We're right there with you.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to go to another class too.
Yeah, we're 15 minutes over our usual hour, so we won't tell Richard, although he'll see the recording. But we'll respect the spirit of that idea of like an hour that is really productive and that we look forward to the next one, you know, and that ideas carry over from one week to another. And maybe on behalf of me and Mika and the curators, we invite more comments on this as we are kind of an experimental ground, right? Like we have the space and the flexibility to test some things in practice. You know, I think that our small size allows us to do that, and our independence allows us to do that. So we invite any ideas for that type of ongoing experiment in what we like to call, kind of going back to Elvia, a pupla y pampa, right? Like a field of play, you know, expression, experimentation, innovation, invitation to collaborate, all of those things. So thank you all for joining us. What a productive conversation. And we look forward to having you all back for a more structured workshop next Friday, where Pachaisana Institute will lead us in storytelling for social change. So we'll keep up the ideas in the mind, and then we'll collect them again next time we meet.
Thanks.
Bye,
See you
everybody.
guys soon.
Thank you. Ciao.